In this webinar, we're excited to share what is possible for student learning through an ongoing relationship of meaningful collaboration, coaching, and analysis of sophisticated classroom data. I am Kathy Champeau, a reading specialist and adjunct instructor at UW-Milwaukee.
And I am Sarah Ignasiak, a kindergarten teacher. A few years ago, I asked Kathy to work with me to implement a change in my classroom. I wanted to move from literacy centers, a common literacy framework in kindergarten classrooms, to a readers and writers workshop model. Centers were not accelerating my students' learning, and the workshop model provided more opportunities for meaningful work that transfers to real reading and writing.
When we began this work, neither of us knew at that time what was possible, but Sarah helped me understand the world of kindergarten, and I shared with Sarah what I knew about emergent literacy. We formed a team that revolved around the careful observation of the literacy growth of Sarah's kindergartners, adapting curriculum to meet students' needs, and providing differentiated learning opportunities. Sarah's invitation was irresistible. I knew I would learn a lot working alongside Sarah and her kindergarten students.
And I knew I could learn a lot about emergent literacy and better ways to approach developing my kindergartners as readers and writers from Kathy. Kathy wanted to help in my kindergarten class, and so our partnership began.
Probably one of the most powerful ways we approached working together was our willingness to explore what was possible for her students. We wanted to take the ceiling off of learning for her kindergartners and not be satisfied with what was typically benchmark accomplishments.
And it gave me a lot of confidence, knowing I had a partner to bounce ideas off of, to reflect together, and to learn together. One thing that was important to me was I noticed that often we were each noticing different things about what my students were doing, which was helpful. And our conversations that we had around those observations moved my thinking forward. Another pair of eyes helped me to be reflective.
I knew the power of real formative assessment, which is classroom data. Data that is collected in the classroom as kids are in the act of reading and writing every day. I know the exceptional value of that both from my experience working with students and teachers and from what research tells us. But it is critical that we look at that kind of student data and analyze it through the lens of a strong knowledge base about literacy to see what our next steps might be. So being able to do that thoughtfully meant further developing our knowledge base to understand what we were seeing.
I knew that would be a big learning curve for me, but I was excited to take advantage of noticing what my students could do and thinking about how that could help me understand where to take them.
These charts show one aspect of her children's literacy growth, which is changes in book level throughout one school year. While mere book levels don't tell the whole story, it gives us a snapshot into the kind of acceleration that Sarah and I were experiencing with her kindergarten students in 2 different years. It is important to note that the students in Sarah's classroom also had the independent reading behaviors indicative of reading books at these different levels.
As you can see in both charts, many of my students began the year as book level pre-A or A readers, which is very typical in kindergarten. I make a point of also quickly identifying which of my students are already emergent readers so that I can plan ways to accelerate them using what they already know. As the year continues, I monitor my students' progress through the book levels and through their reading behaviors. Current independent book level is data I provide to our district, but in the classroom daily, I actually work with students within book level bands because no one book level captures what my students can do.
What we know is, within book levels, there are many variables connected to why books are leveled the way they are. No one text captures all of that, so Sarah is able to help match books with students within a range, which has been helpful in accelerating their progress. If a child really wants to try to read a certain book that may appear difficult from our perspective, we notice that determination helps them be successful.
Our district's end-of-year benchmark expectation is for all kindergarten students to be reading in a level D or higher. But through my work with Kathy, I have come to see that I can easily accelerate many of my students beyond that point. This is all made possible through our collaboration around student work and data, so that my lessons are propelling them forward on a daily basis and preventing them from stagnating as readers on a particular book level or reading behavior.
And I think it is really important to note this is all done through joyful learning. The children are very excited about books and even more excited to make Books and Writers Workshop. We'll talk about the critical importance of starting children office writers making books from day one in a bit.
Although book level is important and is usually the key piece of data we report out about our students to the district, I could not plan for meaningful lessons if this was my only data point. Through my work with Kathy, I have learned that literacy is a complex process, and we must look at each student through multiple lenses in order to truly understand them as a learner. This spreadsheet shows many of the data points that I collect on each of my students to monitor their progress and design my instruction. Some of these are my district's assessments. I keep track of how many letter names my students know, how many letter sounds they can produce in isolation, their scores for stretching out words on the Words Their Way spelling assessment. But I've added other pieces that help me know my children. For example, their spelling stage using the Gentry spelling assessment, and Clay's hearing sounds in words from a dictated writing sample. This table shows how many sight words they know, their scores on the PALS state assessment, their book level, and their reading continuum stage. Seeing all of this data, combined with running records, conferring notes, and classroom observations, gives me a complete picture of each of my students so that I can begin to see patterns. Here's an example of snippets of running records I took over time on a particular student. I take running records during guided reading or when I am individually conferencing with a student. Because I have taken so many, they've become part of my routine. It's just like any other new learning. At first, one has to really think about it, and then it becomes second nature.
One of the things we know is that not only do we need to monitor their isolated skill knowledge, but also how flexibly and strategically they are using that information as readers and writers. Do they know how to draw upon what they know when reading and writing? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So that is part of our constant conversations together.
Remember when Mike came into kindergarten as one of the students we were most concerned about because he did not know many letter names, sounds, or sight words? He was a pre-A level reader with limited knowledge about concepts of print when encountering text. As mentioned before, we kept track of his isolated knowledge throughout the year, including letter names, letter sounds, sight words, book level, Words Their Way spelling assessment, Gentry spelling assessment, and PALS data.
And most importantly, we knew that we needed to notice how Mike used what he knew through the use of running records over time. Knowing skills in isolation, but not using them when reading and writing is problematic. As a result of the information, Sarah and I were able to group students based on need to determine whole class and small group instruction. And I know you take running records both on new reads and on a book they have read once before. It gives us different information. Here are some samples that show us what Mike was doing on new reads over time.
Remember, Kathy, how we were ecstatic when Mike was really looking at print and noticing some of the details of words? Of course, at first he was noticing just that first letter and using it, but then he moved along to looking carefully through the whole word.
And you were always monitoring that Mike knew what the story was about as he was reading and not just figuring out words for word's sake. We had conversations about frustrational books when meaning was breaking down too much. I remember you developed some mini lessons for your whole class around the idea that readers think while they read. Sometimes at kindergarten they get stuck at the word level.
I could tell when I needed to change his book level, either making it easy or accelerating him, and which skills and strategies needed reinforcing. As a new read, his self-corrections and what he did at the point of error told me a lot about what he was doing as a reader. The cool thing is, over time, he began keeping meaning going while he was using what he knew about decoding.
One of the things that is really helpful is collecting this type of reading data about all of your kids so we could determine flexible groupings.
Yes, through analyzing and discussing what we noticed in running records and conferencing notes, we were able to identify strategy needs that led to small strategy groups. As you can see from my chart, this allowed me to not only pull groups based on current book level, but also based on current strategy needs, and having students from multiple book levels in one group furthered their ability to learn from each other.
Strategy groups across book levels are but one way for your students to learn how to become stronger readers. You provide many opportunities through workshop for your students to learn, not only from you, but from each other. These multiple opportunities really accelerate their learning much more than if they were only learning during the lesson. This is a critical component. Sarah, I think one thing is really evident. You've learned to collect a lot of data and you manage it in a way that is not overwhelming. You use it thoughtfully on a regular basis. Let's talk about how you do that.
Well, I started with making charts of all the district assessment data, such as letters, sounds, and book level, like I showed on the previous slide of my literacy spreadsheet. But then, as I learned more about the complex nature of emergent literacy acquisition, we discussed how I needed more than just those numbers to get a complete picture of my students as readers and writers. I began taking observational and anecdotal notes on what my students were doing and saying as they were engaged in the literacy experiences I designed for them. This revealed a deeper level of their thinking and allowed me to see what they were paying attention to and where their confusions were.
Well, I know that we work together to create a system of keeping track of those observations. So can you talk about that some more?
I created tabbed binders where I keep my notes and assessments for each student, so that when we sit down to plan and think about my students, we can look through all of the pieces of the puzzle that I have collected. Having all of the district assessment data, work samples, observation notes, and running records right in front of me helps us to notice more about each student as a whole learner than we would have seen if we had just looked at each of these data points independently.
We know how valuable it is to take running records on a regular basis, and you have made that part of your routine. Can you talk more about how you use those?
Running records have become such an informative and critical piece of information for getting deeper at what my students are paying attention to when they are reading. They are so much more than just a way to determine current book level. I learned from you and from the early reading empowerment course I took how to really analyze running records for how my students are processing text. From this, I realized what a valuable tool they are, and I make a point of finding time each day to take running records on a few kids. I do this during different times of the day, such as during guided groups, conferencing, and independent reading time, so that I'm continuously collecting this meaningful data instead of only doing it at the end of terms.
In order to create this kind of focused instruction, we needed to understand more deeply what was important to observe. So Sarah and I attended a number of workshops together. We were part of book studies around critical professional texts, and Sarah also took the class she mentioned through UW-Milwaukee called Early Reading Empowerment, where she learned about the complexities of teaching emergent readers and writers.
Anne McGill-Franzen's book, Kindergarten Literacy, gave me insight into the kind of data I needed to collect and then how to form these strategic groups based on that data. The Early Reading Empowerment class centered around Marie Clay's work and taught me how to help my students become independent, strategic problem solvers when reading. Peter Johnston's book, Choice Words, really helped me to examine how my language affects student learning. Most recently, I also found resources that support my students' literacy development through our PALS state assessment and other district-provided resources.
I knew an important place to begin was developing Sarah's young students as writers. Writing is a powerful way to accelerate her students' literacy learning. It's just as important that children see themselves as writers and not just readers. Sarah and I meet together regularly about her students' writing, and we talk about what we see her children doing and the process they engage in.
I think the most critical change that I made was having my students make books on their first day in kindergarten. That allowed them to think like writers and illustrators using what they know about books to create their own. On this slide, you can see one of my students, Elizabeth's, current book about space.
The complexity of the way Elizabeth crafted this nonfiction book is amazing. Let's talk about it.
Well, Elizabeth actually wrote this book independently without any conferencing, but this came near the end of our unit of study on writing informational books, so she had been immersed in that study in a workshop format for a while. She had been studying about space for a while, and she internalized a lot of learning and was able to use that learning to make important decisions when crafting this book. I had taught mini lessons about the ways authors learn about a topic, which is by reading books, using the computer, and talking to others. Elizabeth did all three of these things in order to write this book.
I see that Elizabeth decided to incorporate a table of contents, and what she decided to include in her book is exciting. Asteroid belts? I think I might learn something from this. The thinking behind this, pulling that off, is pretty sophisticated.
Elizabeth readily decides what she wants to write about. In fact, coming up with ideas is rarely a problem for my students. My students know just about anything can be a topic to write about, and they often talk with each other about their writing ideas.
Sarah, the tracks of your teaching are evident in Elizabeth's ability to make decisions as a writer.
Elizabeth writes on topic across many pages and clearly writes with intentions, adding a lot of information. These are not simple sentences with simple information. She wants her reader to learn more about outer space. She has her reader clearly in mind. Most of my kids have no trouble staying on one topic in a book. When they started writing books from day one, most realized that that's what books are like.
I do remember some that had random ideas on each page. We noted that, and you had small writing groups with kids who knew how to stay on topic, teaching the others how staying on topic is important in books and how to do that. Elizabeth also structures text in interesting ways. She varies sentence structure to make her writing piece fun to read, and she uses clever words like reddish and orangish. And Sarah, she used headings on her own to convey the main topic on each page in her book. Think about what Elizabeth needed to do in order to decide on her headings.
Yeah, she needed to organize all the information she wanted to include about space in her book into categories. When we were studying nonfiction in Reader's Workshop, my students were noticing that there were these words at the top of the pages in many of the informational books they were reading and in the ones I was using in shared reading.
I remember some of the mini lessons we needed to create in order for kids to understand about headings. You actually did that through an inquiry approach. That clearly paid off.
Yes, I decided they needed to know what headings were, and we developed lessons to teach about their purpose in Reader's Workshop, and then teach them how to create their own headings in Writer's Workshop. Through these lessons, I helped my students to understand the concept of each page having a topic or main idea, which over time not only impacts their reading and writing of informational books, but also leads to the higher level comprehension strategy of synthesizing. Working Readers and Writers Workshop together was definitely helpful.
We don't always do that, but when those connections are logical, that accelerates both their reading and their writing. Going back to Elizabeth's space book, it is also apparent that she is not intimidated by spelling more complex words like someone and discovered. She didn't stick with writing safe words. That isn't even an issue. That's something I keep noticing is how all the kids are willing to take risks. This year we didn't even have to make a I'm not afraid of my words chart.
Yeah, The I'm not afraid of my words chart was something I used in lessons in previous years to help my students get past their fear of writing more complex words, and it is exciting to see that as I have learned more and improved my instruction, the need for those types of lessons is much less.
Elizabeth also has some great beginning uses of conventions, such as punctuation, capitalization, and spacing. It's evident that she has been reading books about space in Reader's Workshop. Sarah, we have been working really hard this year to understand how crafting nonfiction lessons in Writer's Workshop and then focusing nonfiction mini lessons in Reader's Workshop helps them as readers and writers. I remember when Elizabeth came into kindergarten this year. As a reader, she was working on voice print match and level B texts. And now look at how she is so eager to explore higher level texts across many genres in both reading and writing.
Yeah, she was asking me to help her get some books about space so that she could learn more about that topic. It's so exciting to see how she has grown from a level B reader to now reading instructional level H texts in guided reading and during Reader's Workshop. And I think her writing has played a big part in accelerating her reading. I remember how we developed this unit by looking at student writing and unpacking the nonfiction writing process in a way that would be accessible to kindergarten students. Back when we were about to start our nonfiction unit, I remember when we sat down with student writing samples to discuss where my students were at in their writing development, and we set goals for what we wanted them to achieve as a result of our nonfiction unit. We noticed that some students still needed to work on staying on topic across all their pages. Some needed to work on writing more than just one simple sentence on each page, while others were ready to be extended through elaboration techniques. All of my students were ready to learn the craft techniques associated with this new nonfiction genre that they were so excited to try.
Why don't we quickly look back to what Elizabeth was writing at the beginning of the year in September and how she grew throughout the year as a result of our collaboration and your targeted instruction. By looking at Elizabeth's current piece about space, someone might think that she came in as a rather proficient kindergarten writer. She certainly didn't start here. Going back to September, we can get a glimpse of what Elizabeth was able to do.
I can see how she stayed on the topic of colors across all the pages. For text, she wrote only one word on each page in all uppercase letters. Her drawings were scribbles without much thought beyond showing the color. She knew how to use the word wall to find the color words that she wanted to write in her book.
Take a look at this, Sarah. She did not yet understand the concept of writing sentences, and I noticed her book was like many other kindergartners at the beginning of the year. It is a simple list book, but the cool thing is, she is thinking like a writer and writing with intentions. She clearly knew exactly what she wanted to convey and what she was going to do on each page. What was helpful for Elizabeth and all of your students was starting out the year developing the students' identity and agency as authors, illustrators, readers, and purposeful users of language. We were very purposeful in the mini lessons we used and those we developed.
Well, we can clearly see Elizabeth's identity when we read the About the Author page she wrote for her space book. She wrote, "I love teaching people about different things. Kids all over the world like to learn. Learning is fun. I've written about tooth fairies, other magical people, volcanoes, tornadoes, and more. I make sure everything is fun." I think it is so awesome that Elizabeth chose to say that learning is fun, and she listed a bunch of her favorite books that she has authored this year. Writing books propels their reading ability as they learn how to work with letter sounds in different ways and convey a particular message to someone who they want to read their book.
Let's take a look at some of the tools we started the year off with. During that first month in Writer's Workshop, we regularly looked at their writing pieces and wrote our observations down on an at-a-glance sheet or a window pane, just like we did for their reading. That allowed us to analyze each student's writing for patterns within the class.
And then we took that information to make small writing groups where students needed scaffolding to reach a particular goal. That really helped me to think specifically about each one of my students and plan for targeted instruction. I found that regardless of the unit or genre I was teaching, that their specific goals identified through our data needed to be my main focus during small group instruction.
These were flexible groups that changed regularly. You had a group where your teaching point was, I know what kind of book I am making and can talk about what I'm going to write. You got them together so that they could discuss their ideas and have a vision for what they wanted to do. I know you mixed in some kids who were doing that so they could talk it through with others. You called them your developing vision kids.
Remember another group were those kids that were only writing a word or two, like Elizabeth. We had a group that was, I can write a sentence to match my picture on each page. We called them the caption kids, and Elizabeth was in that group.
Elizabeth has made enormous progress as a writer. Over time, we've learned a lot about the teaching of writing with young students.
Yes, I think the key was attending the conferences with Matt Glover that you suggested to me and reading the professional texts that helped me to apply that learning daily in my classroom. Being able to read his book and then listen to him talk about it and show student work examples was invaluable.
Sarah, together we learned in a variety of ways how to develop your students as writers, and it's really helped us become better observers of students' work. We built off of the work of Katie Wood-Ray, Lisa Cleveland, and as you said, Matt Glover.
In addition, we used the district resources and curriculum. I also attended district-provided professional development around the literacy resources from Lucy Calkins and Teachers College, and was able to combine all that learning into making a powerful impact with my students.
One of the things I keep thinking about is the importance of growing our expertise so that we can notice important changes in your students. Without that, there is much that we would ignore and not find important. And we were constantly analyzing what your students were doing during workshop, not just their writing pieces, but their writing process.
I learned the importance of noticing students' composition as well as their conventions, and like you said, watching their process as writers. Noticing each child's process that they work through as writers was critical.
Because they were writing books from the first day, by the end of the first month of school, we had some great writing pieces to analyze in order to determine next steps for whole class lessons, small group instruction, and individual conferencing. Why don't we look at a couple other students' writing from September to see how they are similar or different from Elizabeth in their needs and where they started the year as writers.
Here's David's writing from September. His story is of himself having to stay home while his mom and brother leave. I noticed that he had a lot of thinking reflected in his pictures, which convey the message of the story. His only use of written words in this book are his name on the front and the words "the end" on the back, which is pretty typical of kindergartners at the beginning of the year. He also titled the book with his name because that was a word he was comfortable with writing, and he knew his book needed a title.
I noticed he drew his illustrations with intentions because he shows feeling on the characters' faces of sadness when they leave and happiness when they return home. We can make note of how he shows sequence of events when they eat dinner and go to bed after arriving home in the car.
We knew that David's letter sound knowledge consisted of 19 sounds and 50 letter names, which tells us his next steps would be to continue to talk about his ideas and work on using the letter sounds he knows to write a caption or simple sentence that matches the picture on each page. On our window pane of notes, I found that there were many other students in the class with similar books that needed to work on learning to add written words to match their pictures, and we referred to them as our letter sound group.
We know that you had students at the beginning of the year that were already writing more. I remember Allie was writing more when she started kindergarten. Let's take a quick look at one of her books.
Here is Allie's writing book titled Outside that was written in September. I can see that it is a pattern book using some simple words she knows and it shows evidence of letter sounds she can already use when stretching out words phonetically. She, too, is writing with intentions and had a clear understanding of what she wanted to do.
I love her title, Outside. There is really a wealth of information about the students that we can analyze from these writing samples. Allie's book is evidence of the types of books she was reading during her first month of school, which were also simple pattern texts. She has detailed pictures. Look how intentionally she made the sun really big when she wrote, "I like outside because it is warm." She wanted it to be a focal point, and it's clear that she already has the ability to stretch words without fear of stretching out longer, more complex words like beautiful and flowers. Embedding illustration mini lessons alongside the other mini lessons really paid off as well. Their pictures are such an important part of their message.
Her next steps would be different from students like David and Elizabeth, because she is ready to learn how to move from a patterned list book to a story with events that happen across pages. I called this the Craft and Composition group. From analyzing their writing on the window pane, we were able to determine these types of common needs in my students. Strategic groupings for students took shape and continued to be flexible throughout the year as they grew as writers and their needs changed. Over the last few years, I've made a lot of significant changes, which has made teaching so much fun and accelerated what my students can do beyond what I thought was possible.
It is evident from being in your room that your kids are having great fun growing as readers and writers. We both have learned a lot working together with your students. Have you given any thought to what your next steps are, Sarah?
That will be our next conversation, Kathy.
We hope through this peek into how Sarah and I have worked together, learned together, and reflected together that maybe this might be helpful for other reading specialists and classroom teachers who are interested in seeing what is possible for their students through meaningful collaboration, coaching, and sophisticated classroom data analysis.